Welcome everybody to our third talk in our online series, and this evening I'm going to be giving you a whistle-stop talk about the history of our catchment, the Don Catchment, from Dutch engineers to dam removal. Basically trying to explain a little bit how we got to where we are today in our catchment and what it looks like today. So if I saw you last week for my talk on historic boats, welcome back. And if you're new to us and you've joined us for the first time, thank you very much for joining, and you're very welcome too. So just while my colleague Sally is doing the tech support, letting everybody in, I will just introduce myself a little bit and explain a little bit about the Don Catchment Rivers Trust for 5 minutes. And then I'll go into the main talk. As I mentioned when we first came in, we're going to record this so that we can pop it onto YouTube for people that either missed it or might want to watch it in the future. So it's entirely up to you if you want your videos on or off. If you don't want your video showing, just press stop video just at the bottom left of your screen. So while the presentation's going on, we'll keep everybody on mute just to reduce sort of background noise and things. But if you do have any questions or comments, please do type them into the chat at the bottom. There's at the bottom of your screens, if you're on a laptop, there's a button called chat and you can type away in there. And it's a bit difficult for me to see that chat going on whilst I've got my presentation screen up. So we'll pick up on any questions at the end, although people might be able to answer them as we go along. And then at the end, there's opportunity to ask questions. I was going to say in real life, but it's not quite real life, is it? But there we go. So I think the actual presentation bit is about 40 minutes, which leaves time for questions. And if I can't answer any questions myself, I'm sure somebody else will be able to on the call. We've certainly got some of our other staff and trustees and volunteers, and if anybody else doesn't know, we'll find out for you. So I'm Rachel Walker. I'm the Operations Director at Don Catchment Rivers Trust. And if you were with us last week, you'll notice that's a new job title, and I'm still getting used to it. I nearly said project manager again. I'll get there. I'll get there eventually. My background is archaeology and heritage management. So I came into the Rivers Trust movement from Bangle, and my colleagues are such things as ecologists and hydrologists and fisheries experts and people who do natural flood management. And I think that's one of the nice things about the Rivers Trust. It's very multidisciplinary and you end up learning things from all these different angles. And I studied the old route of the River Don for my university dissertation, but it was more from a landscape point of view, and I didn't really go into the ecological effects. So now I work for Don Catchment Rivers Trust. I feel like I've gone a bit full circle and you sort of see things from different angles. And that's why we wanted to do this sort of talk this evening, looking at the history of the catchment, but focusing on what that meant for the rivers and the river catchment. So this talk is a little bit of everything, and it is a bit whistle stop because that's like 400 years of history, which you can't really do in an hour, but we'll give it a go. So the Don Catchment Rivers Trust is a river conservation charity, and we're part of the National Rivers Trust movement, and our mission is to protect, enhance or restore our rivers, and we have an ambition to reconnect people, communities and decision makers back to the river and its heritage. And you'll see why we might need that mission by the end of the talk. So this is our catchment as it is today. And by catchment, I mean all the rivers starting way up in the peaks and all the rain that falls in that geographical area will eventually work its way down to the Ouse and out to Gull through the Don to the Ouse. And there's a growing way of working called the catchment-based approach, and that's what we tried to do as a Rivers Trust. So basically what that means is whatever somebody does to a river will have an effect downstream if it's small or major. So it's about understanding that when planning things and looking beyond what's just immediately local to see what the wider effects are. So that's our catchment there. I'm in Goole this evening, which is top geographically, but it's not. It's the bottom of the catchment because obviously the hills are going up through Doncaster, Rotherham and Sheffield. And then we've got the Dearne branching off up to Barnsley and the Rother branching at the at Rotherham up to Chesterfield. So as a Rivers Trust, it's quite important for us to be able to understand some of the history of how the catchment became what it is today, so that we can plan what our priorities are and decide on what the most important thing is for us to try and tackle and improve. And the history of the Don Catchment, I think, can be seen in terms of the different priorities people had in the past. So I've divided this talk into roughly 4 rough sections. So the first being drainage of land to reclaim it, industry, navigation, and then lastly, I'll talk about what our current priorities are and the priority of a lot of organisations working together in the catchment, and that is restoration or improvement of the rivers and a recovery for nature and people. So that's our catchment today. But the lower part of the Don, the River Don part of our catchment, so the bit between Goole and Doncaster, hasn't always looked like that. 400 years ago, in the 1600s, it looked a lot different. And here is a sketch. So, just to orientate you, can you see my cursor? I hope you can see my cursor. But there's Goole up at the top there, and then Doncaster is just on the left-hand edge of the slide there. And the main thing to spot here is that the Don does not flow to Goole as it does now. So if I just flip back, you can see now the Don runs from Doncaster to Goole, but on the old one, it doesn't. Which brings us to our first theme, which is the drainage. Now, when looking at any of our projects, we always start by having a look at maps and aerial photographs of the area. And the older the better, because there's usually a clue in those as to what's gone on, or at least a hint that something has changed in the rivers. So if we have a look at an aerial photo of the River Don as it reaches the Ouse, we can see there that it's very straight. So the Don is the one that's running from the middle left up. Very straight, and rivers don't do that naturally. And then further along the Don, we've got a suspicious looking right angle there. And again, rivers tend not to do that. Obviously, rivers do meander, but the bends are a bit more meandering. That looks like it's being drawn by a right angle, that one. And also you can see at the top there, it's called the Dutch River, even though we know it's actually the Don. So something's gone on there. Now, it's known that the rivers in the catchment and a bit wider had been altered probably way back into prehistory. So for example, Turnbridge Dyke there, I've read that could be Roman. I don't know if it goes that far back, but certainly, again, it looks a little bit straight, and there's a slightly odd junction with the River Went there, which suggests it might have been altered. And likewise, the Bicecar Dyke down at the bottom there. And even if we can't pinpoint exactly when something's happened, you sort of get a clue that you need to be able to look into this further to see what's actually happened. And the big clue with these two is that they're called dyke rather than river, which would suggest there's been a bit of a human hand in it. But around the sort of 1500s and 1600s is when we start to get maps of the area. One of the earliest is the Inklesmore map. One of these days I will look into get copyright to get that onto an actual slide, because it's a lovely old map. It probably just doesn't translate very well on a Zoom call. But I've sketched all this out from sort of reference maps. And this is what the rivers looked like in the early 1600s. No straight bits heading off to Goole yet there. So whatever went on was on a fairly big scale, and what went on is quite well documented, actually. So this whole area was, and still is, known as Hatfield Chase. And back in the 1600s, a chase meant a royal hunting ground. So basically this whole area belonged to the crown. And as you can imagine from all the rivers crisscrossing it and the meres, I think the largest one was just near Thorn. It was very marshy, but it was populated. People did live in it. Now, in the early 1600s, King Charles I decided that this whole area was going to be drained. I don't think anyone quite knows why, but I think people assume it was to make it profitable to get into production for agriculture and things, and better grazing. Now, the chap that the king employed to do this, starting in 1626, was a Dutch engineer called Cornelius Vermuyden. I'm not saying I've got the pronunciation right there. Obviously, there was a track record of Dutch engineering for sort of land reclamation time, and Vermuyden had done a drainage programme down in the Fens before this. So apparently the deal was that the land would be split into three, a third to be kept by King Charles, a third was to be left as common land for local people, although they had been able to use the whole of the chase before this, they were used to that. And then a third was going to be given to Vermuyden as payment for the for doing the scheme, and in turn Vermuyden gave away some to his counterparts workforce. So here's what roughly happened during the drainage. It's a little bit spot the difference, this. So you can see on the left hand map there that the River Don, coming up from Doncaster, used to have two branches. So the first one went north along Turnbridge Dyke, which might have been an earlier alteration, as we've already mentioned, and the one going east sort of through all those multi-channels to meet the Trent. And it was the east channel that was cut off, and the Don was diverted solely into that northern channel to drain into the Aire. So if you look at the right there, this is an approximation of what would have happened. So that entire eastern branch disappeared. Oops, sorry. The river was diverted into the Turnbridge Dyke, and then that meant that the northern branch of the Idle was cut off, and the River Torn would have sort of been hanging in mid-air somewhere. So there was a channel dug to the Trent. So basically the connection between the Don and the Trent was lost in order to drain this whole area. Now, there was a problem with this. I'm sure I don't need to spell out what happens when you try and divert an entire catchment's worth of water into a single channel. The flooding on quite a large scale. The land that was populated along that stretch, sort of from Fish Lake to up to the Aire, was inundated with water regularly. And obviously people at the time were not happy generally with these works, because they'd been used to having the whole of that area, and it had got given away, and they claimed that the third they'd been left with was the worst. Now they're getting flooded, and as I understand it, there were sort of riots locally and tools would get destroyed, the works would get filled back in overnight. But ultimately, local people were a bit powerless because this was on the instructions of the king, and Vermuyden had carte blanche. So eventually, what had to happen was a relief drain was dug to take some of that water off into the Ouse, and that's what the main Don is now. That's why it's known as the Dutch River, after the Dutch engineers. So originally the Dutch River had a sluice on it so that you could control the flow of water, but that got destroyed in a storm, I think, and they didn't bother replacing it. And then later on into the 1800s, that's when we get to get a more sort of managed drainage of that area by means of pumping stations, which still happens today. And you can see some evidence of the lost rivers in the landscape, and the connection to Vermuyden is still quite strong in the area. To say it's 400 years ago. So we've already said it's called the Dutch River. That name's always stuck. It's never been known Don as that stretch. It's always been the Dutch River. And if you look at some of the sort of older maps, the original part of the Don is either still marked on it or is visible. So if you're driving through Eastoft, which is at the bottom left there, you're essentially on the court of the Old Don. And if you know Fockerby and Garthorpe, they used to be two separate villages with the Don running through it, but they're one and the same now. You can't really distinguish between the both. Now it's gone. Turnbridge near Cowick is another clue if you know that area. There's a lovely old stone bridge there that used to go over the northern branch of the Don, but now it goes over, I think it's a drainage ditch now. And Vermuyden's name is still used in the area. So we've got the Vermuyden pub in Old Goole, that's just down the road from me. And my secondary school used to be called Vermuyden School when I was there. That's until fairly recently when a new head teacher said, well, hang on, why are we named after somebody that wasn't universally popular locally? And, you know, they've got a point, because in terms of engineering, the scheme was ultimately a success, of barring that emergency drain into the Ouse, but, you know, it drained the land, it did what it was meant to do. But if you were, for local history, it was probably worse, you know, if your livelihood's been changed forever. Apparently Vermuyden's papers are in the archives up at Kew, so that's on my bucket list when we're allowed back out again, because I'd love to find out more about this, especially about the people that came over with Vermuyden. There's some local names that I feel like they might be connected, which I'd quite like to trace out. Or somebody might have already done this locally, because, you know, there's obviously quite a lot of local interest in this, and people do research. It might be already out there, who knows. So to the second theme, the industry of the river. So that's how the rivers in the lower part of the catchment between Doncaster and Goole got roughly to how we know and love them today. And whilst all that was going on, in the upper catchment, the sort of emerging seeds of industry were heading towards the full might of the Industrial Revolution, and the rivers were a key ingredient of that. Now, if we use Sheffield as an example, one of the first known uses of the River Don to create power was at Kelham Island, way back in the 1100s, I think. And you might be familiar with this area if you've ever visited Kelham Island Museum. That's where I used to work. And the museum there sits on an island which was created by a weir and its bight. So weirs were built into the rivers, divert off water into artificial channels to feed water mills. So here we have the River Don going across the picture, winding its way along. And the white water you can see is the weir. and that created a sort of head of water, and it pushed it into the Goyt. Now, being from East Yorkshire, I called this a leat before I got to Sheffield, and I was told it was a Goyt. It's the same thing. It's just a local term. And then the water would go along the leat/Goyt and turn a water wheel, and the water wheels powered things such as grinding stones and lathes, you name it. So that's Kelham Island Weir as you look at it from the back of the museum. And this is one of the old Sheffield water wheels. You can see the water coming from the Goyt just behind it there. Now, in the early years, there were a few of these weirs, not a problem, but over time, things escalated a bit, and there were dozens of these put into the river throughout the catchment, not just Sheffield. And the more that were put in, the bigger they needed to be to divert off enough water. And here is a map of them. I realise this is difficult to see even on like a bit of massive paper, so it might be a bit more difficult on Zoom. But just to sort of illustrate the sheer number of weirs, so every one of those dots is a weir that we know about, and there'll probably more because some of them have sort of broken down over time. And you can imagine all the legal wrangling that went on when a new weir was put in, because you put a new weir in, that would affect somebody else's water supply, and just years and years of legal agreements going on. But for us, the main issues that these weirs caused, which is still an issue now, is that they became an obstacle for migrating fish like salmon. And salmon used to live in the River Don, and they've been used to being able to get to their spawning habitats in Sheffield and beyond to lay their eggs, but they just couldn't make it over that amount of weirs, and eventually they couldn't sustain the population in the river. More on this later. There's still some examples of working water mills in the catchment. So there's Aberdale Hamlet and Shepherd's Wheel in Sheffield, and then Stainsby Mill at Hardwick in Derbyshire. So there we go. If you've got a to-do list when you're allowed out, put them on it. Now, the weirs were the main reason why the salmon disappeared, but they weren't the only reason. In the later stages of industry, when we moved from water power to heavier industry, pollution in the river was a real issue. Essentially, a lot of the factories just put their waste into the river. And even if the salmon could get that far, it couldn't live in the river because it was classed as ecologically dead for decades. So just a few examples for you. That's one of the ironworks in Rotherham, and you can see the weir just about in the foreground there, and the factory's built right up against it. This is a painting of Sheffield, mid-19th century, just smoking chimneys, grimness. And this is much more recently, I think that's 1960s, if not early 70s. You can see there that factory's built right up against the river. There's outlets there, just letting things into the river, debris building up. Just didn't look very nice, did it? Ecologically dead. Another issue was that the factories used to put their hot water in it from sort of cooling processes, and this raised the temperature a bit, and salmon are really sensitive to that. But that is why you get fig trees still growing in Sheffield and hops. That's a couple of our volunteers. So to our third theme, which is rivers for navigation. So back to our catchment map. after Vermuyden had done his thing, it was possible to travel by boat into the catchment about as far as Doncaster from its connection with the Aire. And remember, the Dutch River was only ever really supposed to be a drain. So although it was sort of a nearer connection into the catchment than getting to the Aire and in, I think it was only ever really used occasionally, even after the sluice was destroyed. So there was trade as far as inland as Doncaster, but you couldn't always get to Doncaster because of the tide. You had to have a really good tide to get there. But there were several small wharves in the villages heading inland. But later into the 1700s, the canal age was upon us, and there was a great appetite all across the country to improve rivers, mostly for trading and carrying cargoes, a little bit of passenger carrying there as well. And often it wasn't just that rivers themselves were altered. Sometimes entirely new canals were cut. So a major undertaking was the Don navigation, and the term navigation here means that a river that has been improved for navigation by a boat. And the Don navigation would make it possible to get beyond Doncaster, well into the catchment, just outside of Sheffield at Tinsley, by altering the Don. And this was being pushed by the factory owners in Sheffield. So what had started off as sort of cottage local industry was now on a large industrial scale, and they were wanting to get more raw goods in and have a means of getting their finished goods back out via the river, because this was sort of well before trains and roads being suitable for transport. Now, the Don navigation was a major undertaking, and one of the reasons why it was going to be so difficult to build was the history of that early industry in the middle and upper parts of the catchment, all those weirs. Because whilst the owners were keen to have that navigation, at the same time, they were ultra protective of their water, because that was their means of power in the factories, and they weren't going to do anything that would threaten that. But eventually, after Acts of Parliament, a way was found, and a big part of this was altering and straightening out sections of the river and splicing in sections of new canal, if that wasn't possible. So just as a little example, there's several examples up and down here, but this is the navigation as it goes through Doncaster. I chose that area because our office is right in the middle of that. So you can see the Don is the line that's running at the top there, and then underneath it is what's known as the canal now, but then further down it all joins up again and you become sort of river it's the river proper again, running through sort of Conisbrough and onwards, and you can see this sort of all the way along the line, kind of canal coming in and straight bits. And the hills were also a problem. We all know how hilly Sheffield is. And if the weirs hadn't been there, it might have been possible to put some locks in to get boats up and down the river. But the weirs were there, and as I said, the owners were very protective of their rights. So that's why the canals often run parallel to rivers, so they can join up where possible, divert off where they need to, and in a lot of cases, the water in the canal is being fed from the river. So after the Don navigation was completed in 1751, that would get you all the way from the Ouse to just outside of Tinsley. It wasn't that straight, obviously. This is just me putting arrows on a map. But it still had that sort of tidal bit between Doncaster. Then in 1802, this is like Canal Boom time, basically. 1802, the Sheffield and Kidby Canal was built. And I always find it really funny that basically that's almost where the old branch of the Don used to be. It joins really close to where it used to be. And I've never quite figured out if that is by design, but it kind of must just make sense to have it there. And then 1804, Dern and Dove was built to Barnsley. Then 1819, the little extension was built to the Sheffield Canal, so you could get from Tinsley right up into Sheffield itself at Victoria Quays. Then I think one of the last alterations was 1905. They extended it back up to the air and cold navigation, which runs from Goole to Leeds and Wakefield. So yeah, it went from a river system to a system incorporating all these canals, and you could get really far inland carrying goods by boat. So I think, depending who you were in history, all that is either genius engineering or pretty devastating if you're sort of either living locally when the Moyden turned up, or were a factory owner, or used to like catching salmon and then you couldn't. But history is complex like that, isn't it? And ultimately, a lot of what went on was to do with people's priorities at the time. But all that history has left a mark on the catchment. You know, it's heavily engineered. There's no getting around that. There's lots of ways left. Parts of it don't work very naturally at all. As I say, for many years, the river was dead. Nothing could live in it. And I think it's fair to say that in the more sort of urban areas of the catchment, people really did turn their back on the river. It just wasn't a great place to be. So, what's our priority? What will people think of us when we are history? Well, there's some things we can't do. We can't revert back to a pre-Vermeulen river catchment, can we? Let's face it. But it's not all doom and gloom. We've got lots of issues to tackle, but as a Rivers Trust charity, we try and play our part in it, and we do so with a team of staff, trustees, and our lovely volunteers. We've got dozens of volunteers. That's some of them up at Ravenside Retail Park in Chesterfield after a clean-up day. Now, a lot of our work since becoming a Rivers Trust has been tackling some of those old barriers, the old weirs that are stopping the salmon getting back, trying to restore their habitats and migration routes. So the type of salmon that should be in our catchment are Atlantic salmon, and they spend excuse me, most of their time out in the North Sea. Then around November to about January, they make the migration inland to spawn, that's to lay their eggs, to hatch them out in the river, and then they head back out again. There are other migrating species of fish, but we tend to focus and say salmon a lot because they're what's called an indicator species. So basically, salmon are one of the pickiest fish. So if they can live in the river, anything can live in the river. That's why we've concentrated on the salmon. Now, water quality from all that industrial pollution has been improving since the 1970s. I'm not saying it's perfect at all. We do still have incidents, but it's okay. Things can live in it, and it certainly doesn't look like that picture now. And I do like this quote from George Orwell's Road to Wigan Pier. So he said, "Sheffield, I suppose, could justly claim to be the ugliest town in the old world. The shallow river that runs through the town is usually bright yellow with some chemical or other. And that picture isn't colorized, that was the color. But it's not like that now. But what we've been doing, along with several other organisations, is finding the salmon ways to get across the weirs. Now, salmon can jump, but the problem with the weirs is there isn't enough water, depth of water running over them for a salmon to be able to swim in it they mostly just end up falling back down. Now, obviously, nobody uses water power now. The weirs are mostly redundant. But when the factories and the works either converted to another means of power or closed, the weirs didn't get removed. They didn't go and take the weirs out. They're still there. So this is just the section between, this is the first one is Crimpsall, Doncaster, and then this is the section running all the way up to Sheffield. And Sheffield is currently the first place where the gravels are correcting the river for them to be able to lay their eggs. In an ideal world, it's best just to remove the weir and let the river naturalise again. But in the urban bits of the catchment in particular, it's just not possible. And as I say, the spawning habitat is in the middle of Sheffield. That's the first place that's suitable. And funnily enough, the area is still known as salmon pastures to this day. The name stuck from history. So what do we do about these weirs? Well, we build the salmon a fish pass. There we go. That's one of the fish passes at Meadowhall. I'm sure many of you have spent an hour or two in Meadowhall. Next time you're there, when we're all allowed back out, go around the back of the food court and you can see this fish pass. So what the fish pass does there is it sort of cut a section out of the weir to give a slightly less of a slope and more water for the salmon to get up and swim up. And then if you see the bottom where you can see the sort of disturbed water there, the white water, that signals to the salmon that's the way to go, because it sort of mimics the rocks they'd be used to finding their way up. It's called an attraction flow. Now, weirs are an important part of our industrial heritage. And a few of the older, more original ones are listed structures. So sometimes we can't do this type of fish pass. We go for what's called an easement, which is basically a concrete bulk across the face of the weir. It does the same job because it gives the salmon just enough water to be able to swim up. And the policy here has slightly changed actually a bit now that the ecological benefits of these fish passes are clearer. You are allowed to put one of those on a listed structure now, because ultimately we're not removing listed structures from the river. That's not what we're about. We see these fish passes as the next stage of that weir's history and the history of the river. But when we are working on historic weirs, we have an archaeologist to keep a watching brief. And we found some really interesting things in the past. This is a cannonball. It might not be a cannon, it might be a shot. I don't know the technicalities here. We need an expert. But this was found under Steelbank Weir in Sheffield. And how it got there is anybody's guess. I mean, it's quite close to Hillsborough Barracks, but why is a cannonball under a weir in a river? Who knows? We'll probably never find out. But now it's not just artifacts that we find. Now a few of these weirs have been investigated, sort of being able to piece together how they were actually built in the first place. So generally, when you get down to the bottom layers, you start to find the original timbers. So I think this is also Steelbank as well. It's the same one as the cannonball, I think. And when you get right down to the bottom, you can see how they did it in the first place. So those are wooden stakes that are driven into the bed with a sort of crossbeam timber across the top there, holding it together. And then they packed it out with the rocks and then put sort of the clay and the rubble to create the crest. And you can sort of see all the different layers as they kind of built it up a bit and made it a bit bigger. You can see all the layers going up and up and up and up. So it's really interesting if you're into that kind of thing, which I am. So I do find it fascinating. Now back to our little map of weirs. So here you can see all the dots are red. So that means there was a weir there, but it didn't have a fish pass. it was really difficult for migrating fish to get across those weirs. And this was in 2000. Now, the first fish easement was put on the Don in the year 2000 by the Environment Agency, and that was at Crimpsall Sluice. And then 20 years on, it's all happened in a very, we didn't do one after the other, but various organisations have taken the opportunity when they could to tackle some of these weirs, and all the dots are now green, which means they've all got a fish pass, which means in theory it's open for the salmon. And last year we got the opportunity to put a fish pass with our partners on the last one required at Masborough, bang in the middle of Rotherham, just near the Rother. And we're starting to see the effects of all these fish passes now, because we've had plenty of sightings of salmon in Sheffield over Christmas and last New Year, which is brilliant. It's working. It seems to be working. We're really encouraged by this, and we're hoping that it does mean that our population is farming. And all this is sort of seen as quite a successful partnership, you know, because it's been about lots of organisations working together to just get stuff done. Certainly when I applied for this job in 2015, I thought, how on earth is all this going to happen? But it's happening. There we go. There's still work going on now on the tributaries. So last year again, we got, this wasn't all meant to happen at the same time, but it all ended up happening at the same time. We got the chance to completely remove a weir. First one we've ever completely been able to remove. So that's Slitting Mill weir on the Rother, and then it's gone. It's gone. Now, the government's 25-year plan for the environment states that we hold our natural environment in trust for the next generation. Ours can become the first generation to leave that environment in a better state than we found it, and to pass on to the next generation a natural environment protected and enhanced into the future. And whatever your politics are, I think that is something we can all agree on. We have to leave things in a better state than we found it. And we don't just do this for the salmon or fish or wildlife generally. We do this for people and communities as well. There'd be no point doing all this fish pass work if it didn't have an impact on people's communities. We thought when we started the project work back in 2016, the work going on across the board would have some impact. And I think if there's been any silver lining whatsoever to this pandemic and the lockdown, it's that people's sense of place and being able to get out into nature and cared for surroundings, even if you live in a city, is incredibly important. So health and well-being is also a big part of our work as well. And I think in history, a lot of things have been done to people, and we want to sort of empower and encourage people to be part of the recovery themselves. So we've got things like community volunteers, and we run school sessions and community events, create walking routes along these rivers when we're allowed. We're a little bit hampered at the minute. We have been for the last year. We're all so used to being out and about. We're not enjoying this home working, but we'll be back to the practical stuff as soon as we possibly can. So thank you very much for listening. Hope you found that whistle-stop tour of the history interesting. If you did want to follow us and the work we do, here's a few of our details. That's our website, dcrt.org.uk. We've got things on there like a blog about our work, and you can sign up to the newsletter. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube. And that's our email there, info@dcrt.org.uk.